President Roch Marc Christian Kabore received the encrypted message at 6:47 a.m. while having his morning coffee in the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The words on the secure communication device seemed surreal. His small landlocked nation of 22 million people, known primarily for cotton farming and gold mining, had just become potentially one of the richest countries in Africa. Within an hour, the president had assembled his most trusted advisors in the secure conference room. Minister of Mines Boubacar Sawadogo sat across from Finance Minister Lassane Kabore, both men struggling to process the magnitude of the discovery. The room buzzed with whispered conversations in French and local Maori language as officials tried to understand what 50 billion barrels of oil would mean for their nation. The president's first concern was security. Burkina Faso had been dealing with increasing terrorism threats from jihadist groups operating along its northern borders. The discovery of massive oil wealth in that same region would undoubtedly attract even more dangerous attention. He immediately ordered the deployment of additional military units to protect the exploration site and the surrounding villages. News of the discovery could not remain secret for long. By midday, international oil executives were booking flights to West Africa. ExxonMobil's CEO received a briefing during a board meeting in Texas. Shell's London headquarters went into emergency session mode. Chinese state-owned oil companies began urgent consultations with Beijing. The race to secure drilling rights and partnerships had begun before the discovery was even publicly announced. Dr. Chen and her team found themselves under unprecedented pressure as government officials. Military personnel and corporate representatives descended upon their remote camp. What had been a peaceful research station was now surrounded by armed guards and filled with people in expensive suits who seemed out of place in the rural African setting. The local impact was immediate and dramatic. Village Chief Mamadou found himself at the center of negotiations he never could have imagined. International lawyers explained complex contracts while offering compensation packages that represented more money than his village had seen in generations. The elderly chief, who had never traveled beyond the neighboring province, was suddenly being courted by some of the world's most powerful corporations. Meanwhile, in major capitals around the world, government officials were scrambling to understand the geopolitical implications. The United States State Department held emergency briefings about how this discovery might affect regional stability. The French government, which had historical ties to Burkina Faso, began quiet diplomatic outreach to ensure their energy companies would have access to the new oil fields at the European Union's Energy Security Committee convened an extraordinary session to discuss how Burkina Faso's oil could reduce their dependence on Russian and Middle Eastern energy sources. China's leadership saw an opportunity to expand their Belt and Road Initiative into West Africa with massive infrastructure investments that would help transport the newly discovered oil to global markets as the sun set over the exploration camp. Dr. Chen reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 3 days ago, she had been conducting routine geological surveys. Now she was receiving phone calls from government ministers, oil company executives, and international news organizations. The weight of the discovery was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The first leaked reports began appearing on social media and specialized industry websites. Energy market analysts started publishing preliminary assessments suggesting that Burkina Faso's discovery could significantly impact global oil prices. Commodity traders in London, New York, and Hong Kong were already adjusting their positions based on rumors and unconfirmed reports. Local residents in villages surrounding the discovery site were beginning to hear whispers about the massive changes coming to their region. Some families who had lived as subsistence farmers for generations were learning that their ancestral lands might be worth millions of dollars. The psychological impact was as dramatic as the economic implications. International media outlets started dispatching their best reporters to West Africa. The BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and other major networks began preparing comprehensive coverage of what was shaping up to be one of the biggest energy stories of the decade. Satellite trucks and camera crews were en route to a region that had rarely appeared in international news coverage. As Dr. Chen prepared for what she knew would be a sleepless night of interviews and briefings, she looked out at the African stars and wondered whether this discovery would truly benefit the people of Burkina Faso, or simply become another example of natural resource wealth, failing to improve the lives of ordinary citizens in developing nations. The official announcement came at precisely 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday that would forever divide Burkina Faso's history into before and after. President Kabore stood behind a podium adorned with the national flag, flanked by Dr. Chen and several government ministers, as cameras from around the world captured the moment that would reshape global energy markets. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of the president's announcement, Brent crude oil futures dropped by 12% on the London market as traders absorbed the implications of 50 billion barrels of new supply potentially entering the global market. The New York Stock Exchange saw energy sector stocks fluctuate wildly as investors tried to calculate which companies would benefit from the discovery and which might be threatened by increased competition. In Lagos, Nigeria's presidential palace, emergency meetings were hastily convened as government officials realized that their country's position as Africa's largest oil producer was suddenly under threat. The Nigerian finance minister called his counterparts in Angola and Algeria, other major African oil producers, to discuss how they might coordinate their response to this unexpected development. The response from ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso was a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. In Ouagadougou's bustling central market, vendors who had struggled to make ends meet selling vegetables and household goods suddenly found themselves discussing how oil wealth might transform their children's futures. Many had heard stories about how oil discoveries had changed other African nations, with mixed results. Aminata Traoré, a mother of 4 who sold fabric in the capital's main market, expressed both hope and concern as she watched the announcement on a small television screen. She had seen how oil wealth in neighboring countries sometimes benefited only the elite, while ordinary people remained poor. Her dream was simple: that her children might have access to better schools and healthcare, opportunities that had been impossible on her modest income. International aid organizations operating in Burkina Faso found themselves in an unusual position. For decades, they had worked to address poverty, food insecurity, and lack of infrastructure in one of the world's least developed countries. Overnight, those challenges might become solvable with oil revenue. But history suggested that natural resource wealth didn't automatically translate into improved living conditions for ordinary citizens. The scramble for access to Burkina Faso's new oil wealth intensified as major corporations and foreign governments offered increasingly attractive deals. The French oil giant dispatched a high-level delegation led by their CEO, offering to invest $20 billion in infrastructure development in exchange for preferential drilling rights. ExxonMobil countered with a proposal that included building a new international airport and modern highway system. China's approach was characteristically comprehensive. The Chinese government offered a package deal worth $40 billion that included not just oil extraction rights, but also investments in railways, telecommunications, hospitals, and universities. The Chinese ambassador to Burkina Faso worked around the clock to arrange high-level meetings between Chinese officials and the Burkinabe government. Regional African leaders watched these developments with keen interest and some concern. Ghana's president publicly congratulated his Burkinabe counterpart, while privately worrying about how the discovery might affect regional power dynamics. Ivory Coast's government began reassessing their own geological surveys, hoping they might have overlooked similar deposits. The security implications became increasingly serious as intelligence agencies from multiple countries began operating in the region. The presence of Islamic militant groups in northern Burkina Faso, which had previously been seen primarily as a humanitarian concern, now represented a direct threat to one of the world's most valuable oil fields. The French military, which already had a presence in the region, began quietly reinforcing their positions. Environmental groups raised immediate concerns about the ecological impact of developing such massive oil reserves in a region already struggling with climate change effects. The discovery site was located in an area that served as crucial habitat for several endangered species and was an important water source for local communities. International environmental organizations began preparing legal challenges and public campaigns. Local community leaders found themselves thrust into negotiations far beyond their experience. Village chiefs who had never dealt with anything more complex than land disputes between farmers were suddenly meeting with lawyers from multinational corporations offering contracts worth millions of dollars. Many villages requested assistance from educated relatives living in cities to help them understand the implications of the various offers they were receiving. The religious community in Burkina Faso, both Islamic and Christian leaders, called for calm and unity as the nation faced this unprecedented opportunity. Imam Ibrahim Ouedraogo of Ouagadougou's Grand Mosque delivered a Friday sermon emphasizing that oil wealth should be seen as a blessing to be shared fairly among all citizens, regardless of their tribal or religious background. As the first week after the announcement drew to a close, it became clear that Burkina Faso was experiencing changes that would affect every aspect of society. The challenge ahead was ensuring that this incredible natural resource discovery would benefit the millions of ordinary citizens who had endured decades of poverty, rather than simply enriching a small elite while leaving most people's lives unchanged. Dr. Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stared at the computer screen in disbelief. The geological survey data from the remote village of Tinikoff in northern Burkina Faso showed readings that seemed impossible. For 3 months, her small team of international geologists had been conducting routine mineral exploration in one of West Africa's poorest nations, expecting to find nothing more than small copper deposits. The morning had started like any other in the makeshift camp they had established near the village. Local children gathered around their equipment, curious about the strange machines and foreign visitors. The village chief, an elderly man named Mamadou, had welcomed the researchers with traditional millet beer and stories about his ancestors who once found black water bubbling from the ground decades ago. Sarah's colleague, Dr. James Okafor from Nigeria, rushed into the tent holding a soil sample that would change everything. His hands trembled as he placed the dark, oily substance on the analysis table. The preliminary tests showed hydrocarbon concentrations unlike anything they had ever seen in West Africa. The readings were so high that Sarah initially assumed their equipment was malfunctioning. As the afternoon sun blazed overhead, more test results poured in from different drilling sites across a 50-kilometer radius. Each sample told the same incredible story. Deep beneath the sandy soil and ancient rock formations lay what appeared to be one of the largest untapped oil reserves on the African continent. The seismic data suggested massive underground lakes of crude oil, stretching far beyond what their current equipment could measure. The team worked through the night, running test after test, double-checking every calculation. By dawn, they had confirmed what seemed like a miracle. Conservative estimates suggested they had discovered at least 50 billion barrels of high-quality crude oil, enough to transform Burkina Faso from one of the world's poorest countries into a major oil-producing nation overnight. Sarah knew the magnitude of this discovery would send shockwaves through the global energy market. She also understood the tremendous responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. The lives of millions of people in Burkina Faso would never be the same. The discovery had the potential to lift the entire nation out of poverty, but it could also attract the wrong kind of attention from powerful international interests. As she prepared to make the most important phone call of her career to her supervisor at the International Geological Institute in London, Sarah looked out at the peaceful village where children were beginning their daily walk to the water well. These innocent faces had no idea that their homeland had just become one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. The secure satellite phone crackled to life as Dr. Michael Harrison, her supervisor, answered from his office in London. Sarah's voice was steady but filled with excitement as she delivered the news that would soon dominate headlines around the world. "Michael, you need to sit down. We've just discovered the largest oil field in African history." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for what felt like an eternity before Harrison's shocked voice came through the static. "Are you absolutely certain, Sarah?" "The implications of this discovery are enormous." Sarah confirmed every detail, knowing that within hours, their small camp in rural Burkina Faso would become the center of global attention. As news of the preliminary findings began to spread through confidential channels, the first signs of change were already visible. Government officials from the capital city of Ouagadougou were making urgent phone calls. International oil companies were hastily organizing emergency board meetings, and global commodity markets were beginning to show the first tremors of what would become a seismic shift in the world energy landscape. The village of Tinikoff, which had existed in peaceful obscurity for centuries, was about to become ground zero for one of the most significant natural resource discoveries in modern history. Sarah watched the sunrise paint the African sky in brilliant oranges and reds, knowing that this beautiful, quiet morning would be the last normal day this place would ever see. 3 months after the discovery announcement, the transformation of northern Burkina Faso was already visible from space. Satellite images showed a sprawling complex of temporary buildings, access roads, and drilling equipment where previously there had been only scattered villages and farmland. The peaceful rural landscape had been replaced by what looked like a small industrial city, operating around the clock. Kofi Mensah, a Ghanaian engineer who had worked on oil projects across Africa, arrived in Tinikoff to oversee the initial drilling operations. He was amazed by the speed at which infrastructure was being developed. Chinese construction crews had built a paved road connecting the oil field to the main highway in just 6 weeks. A temporary airstrip capable of handling large cargo planes had been completed, allowing equipment and personnel to arrive directly at the site. The first successful oil extraction took place on a sunny morning in October, witnessed by President Kabore, international investors, and media representatives from around the world. As the first barrel of Burkina Faso crude oil emerged from the ground, spontaneous celebrations erupted among the assembled crowd. The oil was high quality, with low sulfur content that made it particularly valuable for international markets. However, the rapid development came with significant challenges. The influx of foreign workers and international attention had overwhelmed local infrastructure and social services. The nearby town of Dori, which had been a quiet regional center with a population of 20,000, suddenly found itself hosting more than 50,000 people. Hotels were fully booked months in advance, and housing costs had increased dramatically. Local environmental concerns became more pressing as drilling operations expanded. Dr. Fatou Diallo, an environmental scientist from the University of Ouagadougou, documented troubling changes in local water sources. Several wells that had provided clean water for generations were showing signs of contamination, possibly from drilling operations. Her reports raised questions about the long-term environmental cost of the oil extraction. The economic impact on ordinary citizens was mixed and complex. Many local residents found employment with oil companies and construction firms, earning wages that were several times higher than what they could make in traditional farming or herding. Mohamed Ouedraogo, a former millet farmer, was earning more money as a security guard at the oil facility than his entire extended family had made in previous years. But the rapid changes also created new problems. Food prices in the region increased dramatically as demand outstripped supply. Many farmers abandoned their fields to seek employment in the oil industry, leading to concerns about food security. The traditional social structure of villages was being disrupted as young people left for oil field jobs, leaving elderly residents to maintain centuries-old cultural practices. International negotiations over oil revenue sharing became increasingly complex. The Burkina government was simultaneously negotiating with Chinese state companies, European oil giants, and American firms, each offering different terms and conditions. President Kabore established a special committee to ensure that oil revenues would be used for national development, rather than personal enrichment. The security situation deteriorated as predicted. Jihadist groups operating in the Sahel region launched several attacks aimed at disrupting oil operations. In November, militants attempted to attack a drilling site but were repelled by French and Burkina forces. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenges of protecting valuable infrastructure in a region plagued by terrorism and instability. Regional governments struggled to adapt to the new geopolitical reality. Nigeria's economy, heavily dependent on oil exports, began experiencing pressure as international buyers started diversifying their sources to include Burkina Faso's cheaper and higher quality crude. The Economic Community of West African States held emergency sessions to discuss how the discovery might affect regional trade relationships. Educational institutions in Burkina Faso faced unprecedented challenges and opportunities. The government announced plans to establish a new petroleum engineering university in Ouagadougou, funded by oil revenues. However, existing schools in oil-producing regions were overwhelmed by the children of foreign workers, many of whom spoke different languages and came from different cultural backgrounds. Dr. Chen, who had remained in Burkina Faso to oversee continued geological surveys, was amazed by how quickly the country was adapting to its new status as a major oil producer. However, she was also concerned about reports of corruption and mismanagement that had begun to emerge as various government agencies struggled to handle the massive influx of foreign investment and revenue. The international media coverage evolved from initial excitement about the discovery to more nuanced reporting about the challenges of managing sudden oil wealth. Journalists documented both success stories of individuals whose lives had been transformed and cautionary tales of environmental damage and social disruption. Religious and traditional leaders worked to maintain community cohesion amid rapid changes. Chief Mamadou of Tinikoff, now one of the most famous village chiefs in Africa, used his newfound influence to ensure that oil revenues benefited his community while preserving important cultural traditions. He established a council of elders to oversee development projects and ensure that the interests of local people were protected. As Burkina Faso's first year as a major oil producer drew to a close, the nation found itself at a critical juncture. The discovery had brought unprecedented opportunities for development and prosperity, but it had also created new challenges that would test the country's ability to manage its natural resource wealth responsibly and equitably. 2 years after the discovery, Burkina Faso had become unrecognizable from the country it had been before the oil boom. The capital city of Ouagadougou now featured gleaming new office buildings housing international oil companies, modern hotels catering to foreign executives, and construction cranes reaching toward the sky as the city expanded rapidly to accommodate its growing importance as a regional energy hub. The financial transformation was staggering. Government revenue had increased by more than 400%, allowing for massive investments in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. A new international airport, capable of handling the largest cargo planes, had been completed in record time. The Trans-Saharan Highway project, connecting Burkina Faso to Mediterranean ports, was ahead of schedule and under budget thanks to oil revenue funding. President Kabore stood in his newly renovated office, looking out at the bustling streets below while reviewing quarterly reports that showed remarkable progress. Literacy rates were climbing, infant mortality was declining, and access to clean water had improved dramatically. The National University had expanded to include new programs in petroleum engineering, international business, and environmental science, attracting students from across West Africa. However, the success story was complicated by persistent challenges. Dr. Elizabeth Sawadogo, the country's new Minister of Environmental Protection, was documenting concerning trends in the oil-producing regions. Air quality had deteriorated around drilling sites, and several communities had reported health problems that might be linked to industrial activities. Her department was working with international experts to establish stricter environmental standards. The social changes were equally dramatic and sometimes problematic. Traditional family structures were being disrupted as young men left rural communities to work in the oil fields, earning salaries that were 20 times higher than what they could make farming. Many villages now had more residents working in petroleum than in agriculture, fundamentally altering the economic basis of rural society. Aisha Compaoré, who had been one of the first local women hired by an international oil company, reflected on how her life had changed. As a geological technician earning a substantial salary, she had been able to send her 3 children to private school and purchase a modern house with electricity and running water. However, she worried about the growing gap between families benefiting from oil employment and those who remained in traditional occupations. International attention had brought both opportunities and complications. The World Bank had approved a massive development loan program, contingent on Burkina Faso meeting strict governance and transparency requirements. International Monetary Fund advisors were helping the government establish sovereign wealth funds to ensure that oil revenues would benefit future generations, not just the current one. The discovery had also attracted unwanted attention from criminal organizations and terrorist groups. The kidnapping of 3 Italian oil workers in the northern regions had prompted the government to significantly increase security spending. French military advisors worked closely with Burkinabe forces to protect critical infrastructure, but the ongoing security threats remained a constant concern. Regional relationships had shifted dramatically as well. Burkina Faso's new economic power allowed it to play a more prominent role in West African politics. The country was now a significant contributor to regional development funds and had the resources to mediate conflicts between neighboring nations. President Kabore had hosted successful peace talks between Mali and Niger, using oil revenue to fund reconstruction projects in both countries. The cultural impact was perhaps the most complex aspect of the transformation. Urban areas were becoming increasingly cosmopolitan, as foreign workers, international students, and business people made Burkina Faso their temporary or permanent home. French, English, Chinese, and Arabic were commonly heard on the streets of Ouagadougou, alongside traditional languages like Mouré and Dioula. Dr. Amadou Barrow, a sociology professor at the university, was conducting research on how oil wealth was affecting traditional values and social structures. His findings suggested that while material living conditions had improved dramatically for many families, there were growing concerns about the erosion of cultural practices that had sustained communities for centuries. The government had established the Burkina Faso Cultural Preservation Institute, using oil revenues to document traditional music, art, and oral histories before they might be lost to rapid modernization. The institute was working with villages across the country to ensure that economic development didn't come at the expense of cultural heritage. International recognition of Burkina Faso's transformation came in various forms. The country was invited to join the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries as an observer member, and President Kabore delivered a keynote address at the World Economic Forum about managing natural resource wealth in developing nations. Time magazine featured Burkina Faso on its cover as Africa's newest energy powerhouse. Young Burkinabe were perhaps the biggest beneficiaries of the oil boom. Scholarship programs funded by petroleum revenues were sending thousands of students to universities around the world, creating a generation of highly educated professionals who would return home with the skills needed to manage a modern, diversified economy. Fatou Traoré, a 19-year-old from a farming family, was studying petroleum engineering at the University of Texas on a government scholarship. Her goal was to return to Burkina Faso and help ensure that oil extraction was conducted in ways that minimized environmental damage while maximizing benefits for local communities. As the second anniversary of the discovery approached, Burkina Faso was preparing to host an international conference on sustainable natural resource development. Leaders from resource-rich developing nations would gather in Ouagadougou to share experiences and best practices for managing sudden wealth responsibly. The transformation was remarkable, but questions remained about long-term sustainability and whether the benefits of oil wealth were being distributed equitably across all segments of society. The next phase of development would determine whether Burkina Faso could avoid the resource curse that had plagued other oil-rich nations and instead become a model for how developing countries could use natural resource wealth to achieve broad-based prosperity. 5 years after Dr. Sarah Chen's life-changing discovery, Burkina Faso had established itself as a major player on the global energy stage and a model for responsible resource development in Africa. The country that had once been among the world's poorest was now classified by the United Nations as an upper-middle-income nation. With a diversified economy that extended far beyond oil extraction, the Burkina Faso development model had become a case study taught in universities around the world. Unlike many resource-rich nations that had fallen victim to the resource curse, Burkina Faso had managed to translate oil wealth into broad-based prosperity while maintaining political stability and environmental stewardship. The secret had been a combination of transparent governance, long-term planning, and genuine commitment to equitable development. President Kabore, now serving his second term with overwhelming popular support, reflected on the transformation during a state visit to Norway, where he was studying how another oil-rich nation had managed its natural resource wealth. The Burkina Faso Sovereign Wealth Fund now held more than $200 billion in assets, ensuring that future generations would benefit from today's oil extraction even after the reserves were eventually depleted. The environmental challenges that had emerged in the early years of oil development had been addressed through innovative partnerships with international environmental organizations. Dr. Fatou Diallo, now heading the African Center for Sustainable Energy Development based in Ouagadougou, had pioneered new techniques for oil extraction that minimized ecological impact while actually improving local environmental conditions through reforestation and water management projects. The success story was perhaps most visible in the transformation of individual lives. Aminata Traoré, the market vendor who had watched the initial announcement with a mixture of hope and skepticism, was now a successful businesswoman operating a chain of modern retail stores across West Africa. Her children had all completed university education, with 2 becoming doctors and 1 an international lawyer specializing in natural resource law. Chief Mamadou of Tinikoff, now in his 80s, had become an international symbol of wise traditional leadership in the modern world. His village had been transformed into a model sustainable community that balanced modern amenities with traditional cultural practices. The chief regularly spoke at international conferences about community-centered development and had been honored by the United Nations for his leadership in ensuring that local communities benefited from resource extraction. The regional impact of Burkina Faso's success extended far beyond its borders. The country had become the anchor for a new West African economic integration initiative, using oil revenues to fund infrastructure projects that connected markets across the region. The Trans-Saharan Railway, completed 2 years ahead of schedule, had revolutionized trade between West Africa and North African markets. International recognition came in many forms. Burkina Faso hosted the headquarters of the new African Energy Development Bank, and President Kabore had been elected chairman of the African Union for a 2-year term. The country's success had inspired similar responsible development approaches in other resource-rich African nations, creating a new paradigm for how natural resource wealth could be managed. The cultural preservation efforts had proven remarkably successful. The Burkina Faso Cultural Preservation Institute had documented thousands of traditional songs, stories, and practices while also supporting contemporary artists who were creating new works that blended traditional and modern influences. The annual Ouagadougou International Arts Festival had become one of Africa's premier cultural events, attracting visitors from around the world. Educational transformation had been perhaps the most significant long-term achievement. The literacy rate had increased from 36% to 89%, and the University of Burkina Faso was now ranked among the top universities in Africa. Fatou Traoré had returned from her studies in Texas to establish the country's first environmental engineering program, training a new generation of professionals who would ensure sustainable development practices. The security challenges that had threatened early oil operations had been successfully managed through a combination of improved governance, economic opportunity, and regional cooperation. The regions that had previously been strongholds for terrorist groups were now thriving economic zones, where young people had alternatives to extremist recruitment. Dr. Chen, now serving as Director of Sustainable Development for the International Geological Institute, frequently returned to Burkina Faso to study how the country had managed its remarkable transformation. She was particularly impressed by how local communities had been empowered to participate in decision-making about development projects affecting their areas. The global energy landscape had been permanently altered by Burkina Faso's emergence as a major producer. Oil markets were more diverse and stable, with less dependence on politically unstable regions. The country's high-quality crude oil and reliable production had made it a preferred supplier for many international markets. As Burkina Faso prepared to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the discovery, the nation looked toward a future that seemed bright with possibility. Plans were underway to use oil revenues to become a leader in renewable energy development, ensuring the country would remain economically viable long after its petroleum reserves were exhausted. The story of Burkina Faso's oil discovery had become more than just an economic success story. It had demonstrated that developing nations could manage sudden natural resource wealth in ways that benefited all citizens while preserving cultural heritage and environmental sustainability. The small West African nation had shown the world that the resource curse was not inevitable, and that with good governance and community participation, natural resource wealth could become a foundation for lasting prosperity and social progress. The transformation from one of the world's poorest countries to a model of sustainable development had taken just 5 years, but its impact would be felt for generations to come. Burkina Faso had not just discovered oil, It had discovered a new model for how nations could turn natural resource wealth into human prosperity, while maintaining their cultural identity and environmental stewardship.